They say the best revenge is living well, but I'll let you in on a little secret. The absolute best revenge is sitting across a white tablecloth from your enemies and letting them think they've already crossed the finish line. Welcome back to my channel. Grab a cold drink, kick back, and remember the folks in these stories had every opportunity to take the high road. They just took the wrong exit. Do me a favor. Drop a comment below and hit that subscribe button. You're going to fit right in around here. The funniest thing about having real money is that nobody believes you when you look like a regular guy. And I mean that literally. I drive a 1998 Ford F-150 with a busted passenger side mirror that I've been meaning to fix for 3 years. I wear a basic Timex watch. Not as some ironic tech bro statement, and not because I have a billionaire complex. I just like it. It tells the time. It doesn't need to plug into a wall every night, and it survives the rain. What else do you need? My name is Jack Vance, and for the last 22 years, I've been the sole owner of Vance Ward Logistics, a heavy freight and supply chain powerhouse that quietly dominates the Midwest and the Sun Belt. We run 18-wheelers across 14 states and keep just under 4,000 blue-collar Americans on the payroll. Last fiscal year, our net profit hit a number that would make you choke on your beer if I said it out loud. But if you walked past my driveway on a Sunday morning in Omaha, Nebraska, and saw me in a faded Carhartt jacket and beat-up work boots smoking a brisket in the backyard, you'd probably ask if I needed a few bucks to mow your lawn. You certainly wouldn't offer me a seat at a corporate board table. And that is exactly the way I like it. Now, my daughter Chloe, God bless her, didn't inherit my love for flying under the radar. She's razor-sharp, drop-dead gorgeous, has her mother's smile, and, unfortunately, her mother's blind spot for overly polished guys. When she brought Luke Pierce home to watch Sunday football for the first time 3 years ago, I gave him a firm handshake, looked him dead in the eye, and thought that this kid had never been told no in his entire life. You can spot them from a mile away. There's a specific kind of gloss to guys like that, like society has been paving the road ahead of them since they were born. Luke wasn't a bad guy. I want to be fair about that, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself while flipping burgers on the grill. He was Ivy educated, wore tailored slacks to a backyard BBQ, and had a confidence that took up all the oxygen in the room. So, I quietly ran him through my company's internal vetting matrix. Yes, I ran a background check on my daughter's boyfriend. I won't apologize for it. His track record was rock solid. His business instincts were lethal. So, when Chloe told me she was talking marriage, I did something I hadn't done for any executive hire in 2 decades. I let my heart make a business decision. I made Luke Pierce the CEO of Vance Ward Logistics. He had absolutely no clue who was actually signing his paychecks. As far as Luke knew, he got headhunted by a top-tier executive search firm in Chicago, ran the gauntlet with a panel of senior directors, and landed the corner office on pure merit, which, honestly, he mostly did. I just took the hinges off the door for him. Chloe was in on it, obviously. She thought it was equal parts endearing and completely unhinged. Sitting at my kitchen island with a can of Diet Coke the night I laid out the plan, she told me that I realized this sounded like the plot of a bad daytime soap opera. I told her I preferred to call it strategic asset management. She gave me the look. Any father of a daughter knows the look. It's the one that translates to telling you she loves you, but you need professional help. For 14 months, the engine hummed perfectly. Luke ran the company like a machine, honestly better than I'd anticipated. It kind of ticked me off and made me proud at the same time, mostly because it meant Chloe's taste in men was better than I gave her credit for, and I wasn't ready to admit that out loud yet. Then, on a rainy Thursday night in March, Luke called my cell. He didn't sound like a son-in-law. He used his corporate voice, warm, respectful, but dripping with that slight patronizing tone young hotshots use when they think they're humoring a retired old-timer. He told me he'd love for me to join them for a nice dinner because he wanted me to officially meet his folks. They flew in from the East Coast for the weekend, and they'd been dying to finally sit down with me. My stomach did a slow roll when he said that. It wasn't exactly a red alert, but it was that cold prickle you get at the back of your neck when you hear a song you recognize but can't name the artist. I asked if they'd been asking about me. He said yeah, followed by a half-second of dead air that hung around just a fraction too long, adding that I knew how parents could be, and that they just wanted to know the family their boy married into. Every instinct I had told me to pass. But there is a version of me, the guy who spent 3 decades clawing a trucking empire out of the dirt, the guy who survived the economic crashes and came out swinging, that doesn't back down from a gut feeling. He walks right into the fire to see who's holding the match. I told him sure thing and to text me the address. The spot was called the Sterling. It's one of those downtown steakhouses where the menus don't have dollar signs, the waiters memorize your life story, and the lighting makes everyone look like a movie star. I put on my cleanest pair of Levi's and my best flannel shirt, on purpose. Luke was waiting in the lobby, looking fresh from an expensive barber, wearing a sport coat that probably cost more than the engine in my Ford. He took one look at my boots, and to his absolute credit, he didn't even blink. He told me I looked great. I replied that I looked like a guy who didn't want to pay $20 for valet. He chuckled. I didn't. Inside, Todd and Beth Pierce were already at the booth. Now, let me give you a piece of free advice about human nature. People who are setting a trap always overplay their hand during introductions. They're too loud, too accommodating. Their teeth show before the smile reaches their eyes. Todd stood up and hit me with the two-handed politician shake. In my world, a guy who covers your hand with his left hand is either a saint or a snake. He loudly declared that they had heard just tremendous things and urged me to slide in and get comfortable. Beth patted my forearm and cooed about how wonderfully cozy I looked. That's country club code for seeing my flannel and categorizing me as a harmless hillbilly. Perfect. We ordered steaks. We shot the breeze. Luke talked in broad strokes about his corporate gig, keeping everything vague out of a misguided sense of professional courtesy so he wouldn't confuse me with logistics jargon. Todd asked about my little house in Omaha. I told him I was getting my smoker ready for brisket season. He gave me that blank nod people use when they've completely tuned you out. And then, right around the 40-minute mark, just as the New York strips hit the table, and I was starting to think I was just being paranoid, Todd reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. He pulled out a heavy, ivory-colored envelope, the kind of thick, textured paper that lawyers use. He set it on the mahogany table right in front of me. He didn't toss it. He placed it gently, like he was planting a flag. He laced his fingers together. Beth took a long, dramatic sip of her Chardonnay. And Luke, this is the detail that burned into my brain. Luke stared straight down at his mashed potatoes like they were about to explode. Todd dropped his voice an octave to signal playtime was over, stating that they'd been looking forward to this sit-down for a very long time, because there were some skeletons in the closet regarding my past that they felt needed to be addressed. I looked at the thick envelope. I looked at Todd. I looked at my son-in-law, who was still refusing to make eye contact, and my brain just clicked. There it is. 22 years of building an empire, 22 years of total radio silence, 22 years of assuming that the mess with Seth Ward was buried 6 feet deep. I picked up my glass of ice water, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it down with a sharp clink against the table. I leaned back in the leather booth and told Todd that before I cracked the seal on whatever he was selling, he ought to know a fundamental truth about how I operate. Todd flashed a patient, pitying smile, the smile of a poker player who thinks he's holding a royal flush, and told me he was all ears. I leaned over my plate, dropping my voice so only the 4 of us could hear, and told him that I never sit down at a table I haven't already figured out how to flip. The envelope sat between the salt and pepper shakers like a live grenade. And nobody sitting in that booth, not Todd, not Beth, and certainly not Luke, realized that I was the one holding the pin. If you're hooked on this story, do me a solid and smash that subscribe button. A ton of folks watch these without subscribing, but it's totally free and keeps the lights on around here. Appreciate you. I didn't touch the envelope. That detail is critical. This was a chess match, and the entire board hinged on who broke eye contact first. Todd Pierce had probably spent weeks rehearsing this power play in the mirror. The expensive restaurant, the timing, the dramatic ivory paper, it was all choreographed. And choreography falls apart the second your dance partner refuses to step to the beat. I had zero intention of dancing. I picked up my steak knife, sliced a piece of my strip, chewed it slowly, and let the dead silence suffocate that table. Beth started fidgeting with her napkin. The smug little smile on Todd's face twitched at the edges. Luke looked like he wanted to crawl under the floorboards. Finally, after a glorious, agonizing 45 seconds of chewing, I set my fork down, dabbed my mouth, and casually dragged the envelope over. Inside was a stack of photocopies. Crisp, meticulously organized, heavily indexed. A lawyer definitely put this binder together. I didn't bother reading the fine print. I didn't have to. The moment my eyes caught the name bolded at the top of the index, my heart iced over, and my pulse flatlined into absolute calm. Seth Ward. Let me give you a quick history lesson on Seth Ward. Back in 1985, Seth and I were business partners down in Kansas City. We were 26, hungry, and broke in that very specific way that only young guys with massive egos and zero cash flow can be. We started a gritty little supply-run business hauling industrial steel parts. Nothing sexy, but the kind of blue-collar heavy lifting that keeps the American grid running. For 4 years we grinded. And for 4 years I looked the other way every time Seth showed his true colors. He was a parasite. He was skimming funds off the top, not all at once, but like a slow leak in a tire. Siphoning pennies until you wake up to find the rim sitting on the pavement. By 1989, Seth had bled our joint operating accounts dry to bankroll a shadow company. He was poaching our biggest clients using my sweat equity and my personal handshakes. When I finally caught him, I didn't scream. I didn't throw punches. I went dead silent. I spent 6 brutal months pulling strings. I tracked every wire transfer, every stolen manifest, every forged notary stamp. And when my binder was thick enough to send him to federal prison for a decade, I locked the door to our crappy Kansas City office, sat across from him, and handed him a binary choice. Sign over his remaining 50%, dissolve his Shadow LLC, and vanish from the state of Missouri forever. Or I walk my binder across the street to the district attorney, and he spends his 30s eating off a metal tray. Seth chose to run. I rebuilt the company from the ashes, by myself, and promised God I'd never take on a partner again. What I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly have known, was that Seth Ward had a half-brother who was 15 years younger than him. A kid who was maybe 11 years old when all the fireworks went off. A kid who grew up listening to the sob story of a con man who never had the spine to admit he got caught stealing. That kid grew up to be Todd Pierce. I slid the papers back into the envelope and looked at Todd. He was staring at me with the manic intensity of a guy who had been waiting 30 years to throw a punch. I asked him flatly where exactly he dug this up. Todd spat out that Seth kept receipts, his personal logs, documenting every threat I made and every strong-arm tactic, accusing me of bullying him out of the empire he built with his bare hands. I nodded slowly, like I was humoring a toddler, and asked how long he'd been sitting on this. He snapped that it had been long enough, revealing that Seth died 4 years ago of emphysema, penniless, because of the life I stole from him. And there it was, the raw nerve under the tailored suit. Honestly, I felt a tiny twinge of pity for the guy. He genuinely believed his own crusade. I told Todd smoothly that I was sorry his brother passed. He rejected my fake sympathy. I told him fair enough, and asked him to cut to the chase and give me the price tag. Todd leaned over the table, dropping his voice to a hostile whisper, demanding that I step down effectively immediately from whatever advisory board I was sitting on at Vance Ward, wire a multi-million-dollar settlement to his family trust as back pay for what I stole from Seth, and have the ink dry before his son's pristine reputation got dragged through the mud when this went public. That was the exact moment Luke finally lifted his head. I need to paint a picture of Luke's face right then, because it's the pivot point for the rest of his life. He didn't look like a guy in on a blackmail scheme. He looked like a guy who just got hit by a freight train. The blood drained out of his cheeks. He looked from Todd to me and back to Todd. It was the sheer panic of a guy who thought he was showing up to eat a medium-rare steak, only to realize he was the bait in a bear trap. He stammered for his dad, but Todd barked at him to stay out of it. It sounded like a padlock snapping shut. Luke actually flinched. I logged that interaction in my mental ledger. I locked eyes with Luke and asked him how long he had known about this. Luke opened his mouth, stammered, and looked at his dad for permission. I pushed a little sharper, telling him I was talking to him and not his handler. Luke ran a shaky hand through his expensive haircut and confessed that he knew there was bad blood between the families because his dad told him right before Chloe and he got engaged. He choked on the words, saying his dad told him there was an old score to settle and that him getting tight with my family was an opportunity. I pushed him, asking if it was a strategic entry point. Luke looked away. That was all the confession I needed. Beth chose that exact second to reach across the table and squeeze my wrist with a smile so synthetic I could smell the plastic, cooing that there was no need for hostility because we were all one big family now and they just wanted to balance the scales. I looked down at her manicured hand. I looked up at her Botox smile. I told her entirely too cheerfully that I needed her to clean the wax out of her ears and listen to me. I explained that when a guy survives in the freight business for 30 years, he doesn't walk into an ambush without wearing Kevlar, especially when his gut has been screaming at him all week, and especially when a ghost named Seth Ward is involved. I reached into the inner pocket of my Carhartt jacket. I pulled out my own envelope. Standard white, crinkled at the edges, completely unimpressive. I tossed it onto Todd's expensive ivory stationery. I told him Seth's diary entries were a cute piece of fiction, which tracked because pathological liars usually burn the pages that prove they're thieves. Todd's eyes darted down to my envelope. I explained that what he was staring at were the certified, original carbon copies of our bank ledgers from 1987 to 1989. I told him he'd find the unauthorized wire transfers to a Shell LLC registered under Seth's wife's maiden name, the forged purchase orders, and the real smoking gun, a sworn, notarized affidavit from a guy named Glenn. Glenn was Seth's personal CPA, a 71-year-old who plays golf 3 days a week, and was practically begging for a reason to testify under oath about how he laundered money on his brother's strict orders. Todd's face shattered. The arrogant smirk dissolved into something hollow and desperate. He rasped that I ruined him, all the polish completely gone from his voice. I shot back hard and fast that he hung himself, and then he spun a bedtime story so he could go to his grave playing the martyr instead of the crook. Todd accused me of blackmailing and forcing him out. I corrected him, stating that I gave him a lifeline, the exact same choice a federal judge would have given him, just without the orange jumpsuit and the felony record, and what he did with his second chance was on him. Todd tried to stand up, but his legs just gave out on his brain. Beth yanked his sleeve to pull him back down. I commanded him to sit his ass down, my voice dropping to a gravelly rumble, letting him know we weren't done there because the only thing at that table that actually mattered right then was his son. I turned my attention to Luke, and for the first time all night, the corporate shell vanished. I didn't see an arrogant MBA. I saw a kid drowning in absolute humiliation. I softened my tone just a fraction and told him I was going to tell him a secret. I needed him to listen to me as Jack, not the guy married to his wife, not the guy in the dirty work boots, just Jack. He gave a jerky, pathetic nod. I told him I knew exactly who he was, that I'd known since the first Sunday he walked into my living room holding a six-pack, and what I was about to say was going to completely detonate everything he thought he knew about his career. The waiter suddenly materialized out of thin air, completely oblivious to the radioactive tension, asking if he could interest anyone in their dessert menu tonight. All four of us glared at the poor kid like he had two heads. He slowly backed away into the shadows. Luke Pierce was about to learn that the blue-collar hillbilly wasn't just a guest in his ivory tower. I was the landlord, and the rent was due. Real quick, if you want more gritty, real-life stories like this one, do me a favor and hit that like button. 97% of viewers never do, but it's the fuel that keeps this channel running. Thanks. People think dropping a bombshell means screaming, flipping tables, and storming out into the rain. They watch too much reality TV. In the real world, the most lethal drops happen at a whisper. You don't need volume when the words weigh 1,000 pounds. I grabbed my water glass, killed the rest of it, and locked onto Luke, asking him calmly to tell me exactly how he landed his current job. His spine went rigid as the corporate defense mechanism kicked in, and he explained he was recruited by an executive search firm in Chicago, went through 4 rounds of interviews with the board of directors, and that it was a dogfight. I agreed with him, noting it was 100% real. His metrics were flawless. He beat out 2 guys from Stanford, and told him to never forget that he earned that spot on paper. Luke frowned, his brow knitting together, asking why I was telling him this. I leaned in so close he could smell my aftershave and explained that the headhunting firm in Chicago was on my personal retainer. The board of directors he impressed reported to me, and the CEO chair he'd been warming for the last 14 months. The ridiculous expense account, the company car, all of it existed under the umbrella of a private corporation that I owned lock, stock, and barrel, and had for 22 years. Luke's brain visibly crashed. He looked like a laptop that just got hit with a virus. He choked out that I was Jack Vance, and I finished it for him. Founder and majority shareholder of Vance, Ward Logistics. I explained that the Ward on the side of his trucks was Seth's name, kept painted on the doors to remind myself to never get stabbed in the back again. I told him he'd been managing my fleet, running my profit and loss reports, sitting in a leather chair that I bought for him. Dead silence. Todd had slumped back into his side of the booth, looking like a guy watching his house burn down from the lawn. Luke whispered why, sounding not like a hotshot executive, but like a little boy asking why I would go to all that trouble. Beth let out a loud, obnoxious scoff, acting like this was some sick psychological test. I shot her a glare that shut her up instantly and turned back to Luke, my voice completely genuine, telling him no, it was me being a father protecting his little girl, and there's a massive difference. I gave Luke a full minute of silence. I just dropped a piano on his head, and I'm not a sadist. I needed him to catch his breath before the final play, because the next 5 seconds were going to dictate the rest of his life, and decisions made in a blind panic are usually the ones that end up in divorce court. Luke squeezed his eyes shut, pressed the heels of his hands against his forehead, and let out a long, ragged exhale. He stared at the white tablecloth, then slowly turned his head to look at Todd. The fear was gone from Luke's eyes. The shame evaporated. What replaced it was a cold, calculated fury. He asked his dad how long his voice absolute ice. Todd swallowed hard and looked at his water glass. Luke's voice cracked like a whip as he demanded to know how long his dad knew I was the owner. Todd tugged at his expensive silk tie, a pathetic stall tactic, stammering that he put 2 and 2 together when Luke mentioned the corporate name Vance Ward because Seth used to curse the name Vance, so he did some digging. Luke repeated that it was when he told him the company name, his tone dead and flat, meaning before he even bought Chloe's ring. Todd blustered that he was securing their family's legacy. Luke stated that his dad used him as a Trojan horse, sounding like he was reading a legal brief, realizing his dad saw who was signing his checks and saw a golden ticket, watching him fall in love with my daughter and cheering him on because he wanted leverage. Beth clawed at Luke's forearm, begging him and saying his Uncle Seth deserved justice. Luke ripped his arm away, like she was diseased, and warned her not to say his name right then. I sat perfectly still. This wasn't my fight anymore. This was a kid ripping off the blindfold and seeing his parents in broad daylight. Intervening would have ruined it. Todd played his last desperate card, the guilt trip, shouting that everything he did was for the Pierces, that I robbed his uncle blind, and that Luke was finally in the inner circle and could have helped. Luke snarled back, his voice breaking before snapping back into steel, asking if he could have helped him blackmail his father-in-law, used his own wife as a bargaining chip to settle a 30-year-old vendetta based on a fairy tale. He pointed at my beat-up white envelope, a fairy tale that I just blew out of the water in 30 seconds flat. Todd's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. He had nothing. I picked up my water glass again, just to keep my hands busy. After an eternity, Luke slowly turned his body back toward me. His face had hardened. The panic was gone. He looked exactly like the guy who negotiated our union contracts last fall. He looked like a CEO. He told me evenly that he owed me a massive apology. I told him he didn't, that he was collateral damage. He admitted, his voice tight, that he knew his dad was up to something shady tonight, and showed up anyway, sitting there looking at his boots while his dad tried to extort me. And that was not the man he was going to be. I held his gaze for a long time. I finally told him no, it wasn't. And the fact that he just realized that was the only reason his keycard was still going to work on Monday morning. The relief that washed over Luke's face was palpable, though he tried his best to hide it. I turned my crosshairs back to Todd, who lifted his chin, trying to hold on to whatever shredded dignity he had left. I pointed at the ivory paper and told him that fancy envelope he brought tonight was a bunch of smoke and mirrors, completely worthless against the paper trail I had in my pocket, and that he walked in there thinking he was holding a loaded .45, but it turned out to be a water gun. Todd's jaw clenched tight. I told him I wasn't going to bury him in litigation, not because my lawyers wouldn't enjoy it, but because Seth was his brother, and grief makes people do incredibly stupid things. I told him I got it, that I was truly sorry his brother fed him a lie, and sorry he wasted decades of his life carrying his baggage. Beth was staring at her lap, her eyes glistening. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But I warned him to pay very close attention because I wouldn't repeat myself. I leaned over the table and declared that Luke is the CEO of my logistics empire. Chloe is my daughter and holds the controlling shares of the entire board, and his boy married into a dynasty that he just tried to rob. I made it clear that the only reason he wasn't standing in the unemployment line right then, and the only reason their family name wasn't ruined, was because he just proved to me that he had absolutely nothing in common with them. The silence that followed was heavy, thick, and utterly priceless. Todd Pierce slowly picked up his linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it next to his half-eaten steak. It's what defeated men do when they don't know what else to do with their hands. He muttered to Beth to get her coat. She stood up quickly, refusing to make eye contact with me or her son. Todd hesitated for a split second, reaching for his ivory envelope, then thought better of it and left it on the table. Smart move. As he slid out of the booth, he paused near Luke, telling him he'd give him a call. Luke didn't even turn his head, replying that maybe they'd talk later, but definitely not tonight. The space between those words was a mile wide. Todd and Beth Pierce walked out of the Sterling, and I watched them go. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I just felt that quiet, satisfying hum you get when you finally tighten the last bolt on a project that's been sitting in the garage for 30 years. Luke and I sat in silence for a solid minute. The waiter popped his head back around the corner, sensing the coast was finally clear, and asked about the dessert menu. Luke looked at me. I looked at Luke. I said yeah, and ordered 2 slices of the New York cheesecake and 2 black coffees, specifying real coffee and none of that decaf garbage. The waiter scurried off. Luke let out a massive breath, running his hands over his face, and quietly called my name. I answered him. He looked me dead in the eye and said he needed a straight answer right then on whether I actually trusted him to run the ship, not as the guy married to Chloe, but as the guy in the big chair. I didn't answer right away. I let the question hang. I told him that last October, he completely gutted our Rust Belt distribution routes, renegotiated the diesel contracts, saved the company over $4 million, found the bleed, fixed the artery, and presented the data to the board before I even woke up with my morning coffee. I took a breath and told him, yeah, I trusted him. He nodded, the tension finally leaving his shoulders. I held up a finger, making him flinch slightly, and added that on Monday morning, he and I were locking the door to his office. No more secrets, no more in-law dynamics, just owner and CEO laying all the cards on the table. He gave a small, genuine smile, the first one I'd seen all night, and asked if I was ever going to stop wearing the flannel. I told him the Carhartt jacket was non-negotiable. He let out a real laugh. The cheesecake arrived, and it was ridiculously good. I made sure to leave a massive tip for the waiter because that kid had survived a war zone. I drove my Ford F-150 back home through the quiet Omaha streets, the city lights reflecting off the hood. I thought about Seth Ward, the guy he was before the greed rotted him out. I thought about Todd, sitting in a hotel room somewhere, realizing his entire life's mission was built on a lie. And I thought about Luke, driving back to my daughter, processing the fact that his whole world just got flipped upside down and bolted right back together. I pulled into my driveway, the motion lights flicking on to show my house. Quiet, sturdy, and safe. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Luke saying he told Chloe everything, that she said I was a lunatic but she loved me, and that she agreed with him about the jacket. I chuckled in the dark cab of my truck, typed back to tell her the jacket built her inheritance, and walked up to my front door. Some guys build empires to prove they can. Guys like Jack Vance build them to protect what matters. There's a massive difference, and tonight, everyone at that table finally understood it. If you like this story, join the community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw stories. Catch you in the next one.